at least four parts. Part number one, Paul as a counselor, and that would be in the passages that Ben just read to us, a counselor. And then number two, Paul as an encourager, and that would take up with about verse 24 through the end of the chapter. Then when we get over into chapter 28 in the first 10 verses, Paul as a helper, and then taking up at verse 11 in chapter 28, Paul will be a preacher. And so we have these four parts of Paul's journey to Rome: as a counselor, encourager, a helper, and as a preacher. Now we're going to look at the first part, and that is Paul as a counselor, actually in the first 20 verses. And I want to ask a question, and when you read in these verses that, we'll just take verse 16. All you have to do is almost point to a passage there. He uses the word we. Whom would that include besides the Apostle Paul? Well, who wrote the book? Who wrote the book of Acts? Luke. Isn't it obvious that Luke had a first-hand account of all of this? So Luke evidently must have been with the Apostle Paul. But he had not included himself with Paul since chapter 21 and verse 18, but now he and Aristarchus are with Paul. Now, Paul was not only a prisoner, but Julius and his men were the ones that are going to take Paul to Rome with the other men, the other prisoners. Likely, the other prisoners, along with Paul, it is thought that they may have been on their way to Rome for execution for the purpose of their lives being taken. We don't know. That's just purely speculation. But they found the ship that was leaving for Caesarea, and they went to Sidon. That was a period of 80 miles, the journey that they took. And then from Sidon, they went to Myra, and the voyage got pretty rough there because of the westerly winds. And at Myra, Julius, who was the one taking Paul and in charge of the prisoners, found a ship that was going to Italy, that is to Rome. So he put Paul and all the other prisoners on that ship. And they were carrying 276 passengers on that ship. And there was a strong wind that hindered them, and it took them, the text says, many days to go from Myra to Cnidus. That's just a distance of 130 miles, and they should covered it rather quickly compared to the time that it took. They were headed toward Crete, and if you recall, in studying the missionary journeys of Paul, we studied about when he went to Crete. And then they went into Fair Havens, a place called Fair Havens, and Paul, this is where Paul is counseling them. He admonished them to stay at Fair Havens. But seemingly Paul had some kind of premonition of danger that was coming. Now, he said he perceived, if you'll notice, verse number 10, he had a perception of what was going to happen. The word perceive means to perceive from some past experience. Maybe Paul had been in a similar situation before. But the fact of the matter is, they didn't listen to Paul. They did not heed his warning. I don't know why Julius made that decision. One of the reasons might have been Fair Havens, so-called, was not a suitable place to stay because of the winter storm that was coming. So the storm was coming, and there's going to be a change in the weather because the south wind began to blow very gently. And this soft wind, this gentle wind, eventually became a very stormy wind, and it was tempestuous, and that means it became a typhoon. It became a typhoon, kind of sort of like maybe like our hurricanes that we have around here, or tornadoes. It was called Euroclydon. That word is a combination of Greek and Latin, and it means northeaster. Now, people nowadays don't call it northeaster. What do they call it? Huh? Nor'easter. They just cut out in the north and it's a nor'easter. Going to have a nor'easter. And so they had nor'easters in that day. Now, as the storm grew worse, the crew did everything they could to keep them afloat. And because of the storm, there were days that they could not see the sun in the daytime, the stars at night. So in those times, they did not exactly have what we have today, the GPS and that sort of thing. So they used the stars at night for what purpose? What? Navigational purposes. So they had a hard time knowing where to go, didn't they? You see, that was their navigation, and so all of that happened because they didn't listen to Paul. He said, you don't need to go. So sometimes it pays to listen to advice, doesn't it? I had an old man give me some advice when I was just a young boy. And he's the kind of man I wouldn't take advice from necessarily, but I took advice. This was good advice. And his advice was, never take advice from someone who has not been successful in what you're trying to do. Well, when I first started preaching, I got all kinds of advice from some of my relatives and some of my teachers at school. One of them told me, he said, you need to learn how to talk in a conversational way. I said, what do you mean? Oh, just do it like you want to. Just do it like, well, I was going to anyway, I guess, and I have since. Then I had an uncle who told me that I didn't need to preach like they did 100 years ago. He hadn't darkened the door of a church building since he was a child, and he couldn't stay out of a bar. So why would I take advice from somebody that had never preached a sermon and didn't know one thing about it? And so sometimes we need to listen to people that advise us, and we need to listen to people that are in some position of authority, and we need to listen to those who have experience. I've often said, when I'm talking to young people, that you need to listen to your parents. They've been down the road ahead of you, and they know where the potholes are in the road, the moral potholes are in the road. They know where the curves are in the road, and you need to listen to them. Do you think they're paying attention to that? No. They're going to have to find their own potholes. They're going to have to find their own curves, just like I did. So there was walking in my shoes. That's right. Well, so here's Paul, the advisor, the counselor. Now we're going to look at Paul, the encourager. And that takes up about verse 21. And Paul started out this journey as a prisoner. He was a prisoner. And the reason Paul was a prisoner is because he they had arrested Paul, and they told him, he told them that he was a Roman, that had Roman citizenship, and he wanted to appeal to Caesar. Had he not said, I want to appeal my charge to Caesar, he would have been turned loose. But now he's being sent to Caesar, to stand before Caesar. And so he started out as a prisoner. But it seems like if you continue to read this, Paul almost ended up like captain of the ship, didn't he? And so a crisis does not make a person. Paul's going to be in a real crisis in his life. A crisis does not make you. A crisis shows what you are made of. Now, I know that's not good English to end a sentence with a preposition, but that's the truth. We call it, you're testing your mettle, you're testing what you're made of. Now, Paul is a very cheerful person here. I want you to take up the note in verse 21. Paul said, "Sirs, you should have hearkened unto me. I told you so." Nobody likes to be told that. "And you should not have loosed from Crete to have gained this harm and loss. Now I exhort you to be of what?" This is where he's encouraging them now. Be of what? Good cheer. Good cheer. Why could they be cheerful? There shall be no loss of life. And very good news. And here's the reason he knew that. Verse 23. Ben just read that. "There stood by me this night an angel of God, whose I am and whom I serve." I belong to God and I serve God, in other words. And this is what the angel said, verse 24. "Fear not, Paul. Thou shalt be brought before Caesar." God said, you're going to Caesar, you're going to go. So what did that tell Paul about the storm and the ship? Did it tell him anything? Not to worry about it. Don't worry about this storm, this ship. Fear not. And then he said, verse 25, "Wherefore, sirs, be of good cheer. For I believe God that it shall be even as it was told me." You know, there's a passage I used last week where I was in a meeting, and I want to call our attention to it this morning. That's Hebrews 13:5, where God said, "I will never do what? Leave you, nor do what else? Forsake you. I will never leave you nor forsake you." Now, if Paul was here this morning, Paul would say, "I believe God, it shall be even as it was told me." What we were told, that God would never leave us, and that God would never forsake us. So what was he saying to those sailors? He was saying to those sailors, I believe God. God said we're going to Rome. Nobody's going to die, so why should we be afraid? Now, it doesn't mean they're not going to have some problems, but we're not going to lose any life. He said, howbeit we must be cast upon a certain island. So there was God saved them on an island. Now, continuing. "When the 14th night was come, as we were driven up and down in Adria about midnight, the shipmen deemed that we drew near to some country, and sounded." What does that mean, they sounded? Anybody? Checking the depth of the water. We sounded. Found it 20 fathoms. Don't ask me how deep that was. If you know, you can speak up now or forever hold your peace. Anybody know how deep a fathom is? Look at there. Look coming in there. Anita, her mama, and a baby. And you and Ken been busy since y'all been gone. It is good to see you. Got her grandbaby with her this morning. And got a new one, haven't you? Congratulations. Congratulations. We're in Acts chapter 27, if y'all care to follow along. Found that this is in verse 28. When they'd gone a little further, they sounded again. They checked the depth again, found it 15 fathoms. What's happening, Lewis? The water's getting shallow here. It said, verse 29, fearing they should have fall upon rocks, what'd they do? Cast out 4 anchors out of the stern and wished for day. What part of the ship is the stern? Oh, the back end. I know a man that was fishing out here in the bay, the Mobile Bay, with another fella, and they were in a boat. Obviously, if they're fishing in the bay, they were in a boat. That's obvious, isn't it, Jeff? And a storm came up, and the guy told me, he said, that fella got so upset and so nervous, he threw the anchor out the front of the boat. He said, we like to sunk. We like to sunk. You throw it out the stern. So they cast out 4 anchors. I want you to, if we have time, we're going to talk about those 4 anchors. They cast out the 4 anchors out of the stern, wished for day. And as the shipmen were about to flee out of the ship, they were about to jump overboard. Maybe they let down the boat. They had a little skiff. They put it into the sea under color as though they would cast anchors out of the foreship. And Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, verse 31, except these abide in the ship, you cannot be saved. If you want to be saved, you better not get out of the boat. Where was the safest place right then in that storm? In the boat. Stay in the boat. Then the soldiers cut off the ropes of the boat and let her fall off. And while they were coming on, getting back on the boat, Paul besought all of them to take meat, saying, this day is the 14th day that you have tarried and continued fasting, having taken nothing. So we need to eat. And then verse 34, wherefore I pray you to take some meat, for this is for your health. Then now you think about him saying this to you in the middle of a storm. There shall not an hair fall from the head of any one of you. That's why I call Paul the encourager. He's encouraging these people. You're not going to die. And then verse 36, it had the effect. They were all of good cheer, and they took some meat. And they were all in the ship, 216 souls, 276 people. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship, cast out the wheat into the sea. And when it was day, they knew not the land. They had no idea where they were, but they discovered a certain creek with a shore into which they were minded, if possible, to thrust in the ship. They'd drive up into that creek. And when they'd taken up the anchors, they committed themselves unto the sea and loosed the rudder bands and hoisted up the mainsail to the wind and made toward shore. Verse 41. And falling into a place where 2 seas met, they ran the ship aground. So the forepart struck fast and remained unmovable, but the hinder part was broken off with the violence of the waves. So the ship was broken up. And the soldiers' counsel was to kill the prisoners. Why would they want to kill the prisoners? Well, why would they not want them to escape? Because if they let them go, they'd get killed, wouldn't they? As for law, they would be killed. So the soldiers' counsel was kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim out and escape. But the centurion, willing to save Paul, kept them from their purpose and commanded that they which could swim should cast themselves into the sea and get to land, every man for himself. You get to land if you can. And then verse 44, the rest, some on boards, some on pieces of the ship, and it came to pass they escaped all safe to land. I'm sure you have seen the movie, The Titanic. and seen how the producers portrayed the sinking of the Titanic. And there were people clinging to whatever they could get their hands on, clinging, trying to be saved. And that was what was happening here. Now, this will bring us to the end of chapter 27, but it continues, this journey to Rome continues in chapter 28, which we will have in our next study together. But now, I said I wanted you to remember those 4 anchors. And what we want to do is to see God in all of this. And now you go back to chapter 27 now in verse 29, where he says they cast 4 anchors out of the stern. So to save this ship, he cast those 4 anchors into the sea. And they made it to land without the loss of life. There are 4 anchors in this story. Number 1, this will help us. This is for us, okay? This is for us today. There was an anchor of God's presence. That's in verse 23. There stood by me this night the angel of God. They had not been forsaken in the midst of that storm. They were not alone in the storm. And we are never alone, are we? Paul was a prisoner when he wrote the book of 2 Timothy. And in the 4th chapter and in the 16th verse, he made this statement, all men have forsaken me. And of course, back in the 10th verse, Demas had forsaken him and perhaps some others. But no man stood with me, I believe is the way he worded it. But in verse 17, who stood with Paul? He said, the Lord stood with me. And when we feel as though we have been forsaken by all, remember the Lord is standing with us, that we are never, ever alone. I intended to bring the little, I don't know whether you call it a story. I think it's a poem. I think I saw it in as a poem. And I think it's entitled, In His Steps, and it pictures a man. I'll just tell it. There's a man walking out on the beach, and the Lord is walking with him, and then the man sees his steps, and he can see the Lord's footsteps, but then the man doesn't see the Lord with him. He said, that's when I was carrying you. That's when I picked you up, I was carrying you. We're never alone. Then secondly, there's the anchor of God's presence. See, God was present here. God hath given thee all them that sail with thee. I believe God, it shall be as it was told me. You see, God promised Paul that he was going to stand before Caesar. How much can you rely on a promise that God makes? How much can you rely on His promises? Absolutely, Lewis says completely, totally, without reservation. He promised He's going to stand before Caesar. You know, Paul said, Titus 1:2, God who cannot lie. God who cannot lie. So God's not lying to Paul. You ever had someone promise that they'd do something and not do it? I don't have fingers and toes enough to count all of that. Yes, sir, Brother Lambert, I'll be there Sunday morning. I'll be there Sunday morning. Sunday morning come. I've told people I've got an eye strain watching for you. Got an eye strain. My eyes are hurting watching for you. Promise, but never fulfill the promises. Eric Whittle's daddy, Rick, worked with me as the youth minister over at Saraland 6 years. And Rick became one of the finest preachers in this county. I call him a great preacher. He was a great preacher. But we were visiting a family one day, and sitting in the house, Rick was with me, and I said, I want you to tell me that you're going to be there Sunday. If I had $1 bill for every time I'd been to that house trying to get them to come to church, I could buy your lunch and then leave a big tip. Yes, sir, Brother Lambert, we're going to be there Sunday. On the way back to the car, Rick had a deep voice. On the way back to the car, Rick says, promises, 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 promises. All you get are promises. They weren't there on Sunday. That's all I got is a promise. And so here we have the anchor of God's presence, the anchor of God's promise. Third, yes.
You had told us one time when we were studying this that we were living in a time where a lot of people were fleeing the ship. They're just being that long.
All right. That comes in next. I'll say it again. You got a good memory, Priscilla. If you were a man, I'd let you get up here and finish this lesson, you know. All right, now there's the anchor of God's providence. There's a third anchor. You've heard this before, haven't you, Priscilla? All right. See, she's got a good memory. That's been 15, 20 years ago. You really got a good memory. Verse 24, fear not, Paul, you're going to be brought before Caesar. God's given thee all them that sail with you. God, you're not going to have any loss of life. I believe the storm was a part of God's plan in Paul's life. And the safest place for those soldiers in that storm was to stay with what man? Stay with Paul, wasn't it? And see, who was in control of that storm? It wasn't the centurion. It wasn't the sailors that were with him. It wasn't the prisoners. It wasn't Paul. Who was in control of the storm? God. And so because God was in absolute control, they could not abandon the ship. Now, to the point that Priscilla was making, look at verse 31. Except these abide in the ship, you cannot be saved. You got to stay in the boat. You cannot abandon the ship. If you do, you're not going to be saved. So the safest place for those sailors, those prisoners, and Paul was in that boat. And we've got people that jump out of the boat today, don't we? Lot jumped out of the boat during COVID, didn't they? And they hadn't got back on the ship. And where do we go when we jump ship out of the ship of old ship of Zion? As some old timers used to refer to the church as the old ship of Zion. Where do we go when we leave the ship of Zion? Well, I can't improve on that answer. Satan does not want us to stay in the Lord's ship. And what is the vessel today that we are in? We're in the church, aren't we? We're in Christ, and we're in the church. And Satan is after us today. I wish that we had a magic wand that we could cause people to see how needed it is to stay with the Lord. I remember listening to Brother James Cooper, who years ago over in Mobile preached at the Andrew Street Church. Brother Cooper is a black evangelist, a dear friend of mine. I'd go down there and preach for him occasionally. And I heard him on the radio one Sunday morning. And he preached out of Romans chapter 8. And he read this verse. If God is for you, how does it end now? Who can be against you? If God is for you, who can be against you? So in the case here, in this storm, God was for Paul. He was for the prisoners. He was for Julius the centurion. He was for the sailors that were that were commanding the ship. So if God is for you, who can be against you? But then Brother Cooper said, if God is against you, who can be for you? I don't want to get on the wrong side of God, do you all? I don't. I want to stay on his good side. And so these are 4 anchors. There's the anchor, and it seems like there's one more if I can turn the page here. Well, I'm going to have to set my Bible down. And the 4th anchor is the anchor of God's performance. His performance, verse 44. They escaped all safe to land. He promised that they would not die on that ship, and God's promise was kept. And they were able to get through the storm. We have storms in our personal lives. And sometimes in our personal lives, we can't see the light at the end of the tunnel sometimes. But even in the dark times in our lives, even in those times in our lives where we might not be able to see the light at the end of the tunnel, a way out, we need to realize that God is stronger than any storm that we're going to face in life. I think I had that on my office door many years ago. It wasn't worded exactly like that. I think it was like this: God is stronger than anything that I'm going to face today. He promised that, didn't he, Priscilla? God is stronger than anything that I'll face today. God is strong and he's powerful. And he was able to get through Paul through the storm. He can get you. I have an idea, and I'm not a mind reader. I just know from experience what I'm about to say. That very likely in our class, which we've got a good number, and I wish that Steve, if you'd count our number this morning, how many we have in our class this morning. Now don't leave just yet. I have an idea that in this class this morning, somebody, or maybe several somebodies, is going through some kind of storm in your life. I don't know. But I know God is stronger than that storm. And I want to close with this passage of Scripture. Luke 1:37. With God, nothing shall be impossible. Thank you. And we have 56.